Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome to episode 59 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Today I'm here in person with Jerry and Curt. We have just got done speaking at the IPS conference. We did a keynote and a workshop thinking about employment from a trauma-informed lens perspective. So since we were at a Sheridan, we found a semi-quiet corner, so hopefully the sound comes out okay. There's a little bit of background music, but just you can chill out as you listen to our episode this week. So again, just really want to kind of talk about our experience at the conference after talking now for
how many hours?
3 hours straight together. We survived the experience, maybe thrived a little bit, got a lot of great feedback. So just wanted to kind of share to the larger audience about some of the thinking we've been doing preparing for a conference that really, if we think about what these groups are trying to do, is really help people gain employment as part of an overall recovery process. And I think whether you're working with adults or you're working with school-age children where employment is one of the goals for the future, I think a lot of lessons coming out of this. And so just kind of some, as we've all been thinking, at least for the last 4 or 5 days on this, we probably could have been a little bit more prepared, but it all pulled off really well. We basically hit our time marks. Just, Curt, let me start out with you. Just kind of, some of your thinking around this with our conversations and how this topic of employment as part of building someone's self-esteem and as part of the recovery process. What's this kind of made you think about maybe a little differently, or maybe kind of what you do in your work on a normal basis as well?
Two kind of areas came up in when we talk about, you mentioned school-age kids, right? And those that will need employment at some point.
Yeah.
One thing that I've been kind of talking to people a lot about lately is the increased prevalence of people diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder.
Yeah.
And the needs that our society are going to have to educate them effectively and start to get people with other disabilities really to be productive members of society, and how important that is going to be to all of us. We're now at the point where the CDC is rating the prevalence at 1 in 59 births.
Yeah.
Results in a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder by the age of 5.
Mm-hmm.
So just in some of the analytics that I've done in the Denver metro area, that will result in just over 600 new diagnoses per year.
Wow. Yeah.
Which is just an incredible need.
Yeah.
And the number of kids that are turning adults every single year with the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder is now doubling every year.
Yeah.
So now we're starting to see the ripple effect of how this prevalence has increased over time around young children, and now we're starting to see it bleed into all of these other systems and needs that all these kids have as they become young adults now. So for me, it's been fun to think about how much impact we could have in that area. And also bringing a trauma-informed lens to the field of ABA, into the field of autism intervention and intellectual developmental disability intervention. I loved the question we got at our last workshop about, there's this kid with autism spectrum disorder, and I think that this is affecting them as well.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh boy, we could talk about that for a while. So that's been on my mind a lot as I've prepared for this. And I've also connected it to in the analogy of the relay race that I did in my portion of our keynote about passing the baton or waiting until somebody has finished their leg before you pass the baton. I was like, well, that's transition services right
yes.
there. Like, it's not time yet. Don't pass it off yet. Don't get employment involved.
Exactly.
So thinking about backing that up a little bit from a system level perspective.
Yeah.
How do we get people involved with that 14-year-old kid?
Right.
Who's still in 8th grade or 9th grade and is going to need employment services in a couple of years, but we're like, well, we're 5 years too early, and I'm like, we should probably start working on that now.
Exactly.
So I've given a lot of thought to that, and certainly being here and getting kind of connected to a lot of the players in Colorado can be a way to start talking about that, although I know them and they've been talking about it for a while too. But maybe we can do some things with that would be really quite powerful, I think.
Very cool. Jerry, what about you?
Well, first thing is really how bright the two of you guys are, right?
Well, thank you, Jerry.
So I got to present with them, and always, just as in the podcast, listening and being a part of things is stimulating, and in terms of how I think. What I didn't get a sense today is they're instituting a new model. I don't really understand what the old model was, right? I didn't understand a little bit about, because whenever there's a new model, there's still people in the audience and in the field who are thinking in a different way. And I don't know enough about the audience we talked to today about really understanding what's going on for them.
What were they doing if this
What were they doing prior to this? That was one. So I became more curious about learning something about the people we were talking to tonight.
Yeah.
The other thing is that I think that came out of really looking at is that employment is a developmental step, right? And it's the mastery of any developmental step increases someone's self-esteem, increases someone's openness and curiosity to the next developmental steps, to kind of looking at that. And that lots of the individuals, as we came here to talk about, of early childhood experiences, adverse experiences, relative attachment issues, looking at their biology and looking at the experiences they've experienced along the way, is that we tend to kind of want to look at, because you're an employment specialist, you look at this in isolation of all that other stuff. So I think the opportunity here to talk about it and put this life experience of employment into a more contextual understanding of what might be getting in the way of this individual's ability to master this, and what kinds of opportunities do they need, relational, other kinds of resources to be successful at accomplishing. Not just, let me come in and talk about getting a job.
Yeah.
So I think, my looking through the work that they're doing is really beginning to help a lot of people put this in kind. And the last thing I was really surprised, although Matt has said this, is how new this information is to people, right? And so without having some understanding of trauma or, neurobiology and kind of understanding is, how do they understand the clients that are sitting in front of them?
Right.
To kind of do it. So I think both the excitement to be able to share it, but also the curiosity is, what are the barriers in our professional cultures that are keeping this information from flowing?
Yeah. And I think that's, I mean, some of it's interesting because you can go into some systems, even states differ, and who's heard the ACE study, and all the hands will shoot up, or most of them, 90%. And then today we had maybe in a packed room, we had a small room, but maybe 40 people, maybe 3 or 4 went up. And I wonder, I'm not sure if it's a system issue or if it's a natural spreading. I almost think that it's amazing we get the 90% hands go up, because usually one person in that system probably got this at a conference, and there's this organic spread that I think has missed. I mean, you can go into schools now that everybody's been trained on it, districts where everybody's been trained on it, and then you can go to another superintendent, principal, and that's never heard about it, or just it came across their radar and they want to get kind of their first idea of what it is. So it's kind of, in some ways, I think, just indicative of where the paradigm is, and if the organizers of the conference didn't, I think, know Curt, we still would have had a very small percent of the group ever heard the words trauma-informed adverse childhood experience.
Right.
So it's just, I think that's the coolest thing about the podcast and our work is that, somebody called me once, I'm kind of like the Johnny Appleseed of trauma, which I think they meant that in a good way with their experience in the presentation. But it's like, I think having a chance to introduce it gets people, now that they're going to look at somebody sitting across from them in a different way. And I think that's the exciting part that, really revved me up. It's like, oh yeah, when I see only 4 hands go up, I'm like, yes! Because I get to be the one that introduces something that literally changed my life. And granted, most people are much more regulated than I am around life-changing events, but still, it's
you have that
every week. I did Tai Chi, it changed my life.
Yeah,
this changes everything.
Exactly.
I read this book, but it changed my life.
Exactly. Makes life more enjoyable if it changes. It drives my wife crazy at
we
times.
don't know but we don't know if that's because Matt learns a lot of new things or because he forgets a lot of things.
Or it's all selective and I just remember what I want to. I think it would be worth talking about because I think, and Curt, you of the three of us, I think, know the most about this new model that's coming out. Because one of the things that struck me as I was learning to prepare for this is, my understanding of the IPS model is that we prioritize employment and we don't wait for some magical moment where they're ready for employment.
Right.
And I think watching in the housing arena, this housing first model take hold of, let's get someone, no matter they may be using, they may have mental illness, they may have but let's get them housed. And then we see a whole lot of other outcomes improve as well. And I can't help but draw kind of parallels between, let's get somebody, give them the support, get them into the work environment, let them have that hopefully positive experience with getting them set up to succeed. And I love this sort of, not necessarily harm reduction thinking per se, but this like, hey, let's not wait 3 years to get this person into, let's give them the support they need to succeed now. And I wonder if you could just speak a little bit more about the model and how you've worked with it in your role a little bit more.
Well, I mean, one thing to think about this model too is it has some organizing values and principles, and then those things are things like person-centered first thinking, that employment first, like think of that. So there's some organizing values, right? And then the real kind of new thing about this model is that it is crossing one of those clarity points between systems.
Yeah.
So you had a mental health service delivery system and a supported employment service delivery system, and they were not talking to one another.
Yeah.
So really this is a new way of integrating people, processes, and systems more than a new kind of approach to something.
Yeah.
The approach is integrating things from a structural level, and that kind of led a lot to what I wanted to talk about, of that now you've integrated things from a structural level. How are you going to get people to play well together? Because that's the next step of that.
Yes.
How do you get people to cooperate well? You can put them in the same room together. It doesn't mean they're going to work well together.
Exactly.
So that's kind of the new thing about this model. And my friend who kind of introduced me to this, who's Patricia, she now travels the state of Colorado for the Department of Folk Rehab to go to a certain number of mental health centers that have said, we want to partner with DVR, and now we're a mental health center that has all these people who are recovering from behavioral health symptoms. And now if we have a couple of supported employment specialists who come and have an office or a desk at our place that facilitates some crosstalk between the therapist and the supported employment person, at least it gets it into people's thinking about what might be helpful here. And it increases the thinking about what are the collection of resources that we could put together to support a person. In terms of like external resource standpoint, like that maybe they need a job, and
you're right,
and that I know I have somebody I can go talk to, and that I have a relationship with, and that is here every day, and that I trust as a provider to go and broker a relationship with my client.
Yeah.
So I think that's the real kind of innovative thing about IPS. And it's a great idea in that its simplicity is great.
Yeah.
Let's put people together and in that fuzziness, essentially,
Yeah.
between the two systems, some real creativity
Yeah.
can happen.
And I think no matter, I mean, we often find ourselves on different political divides, different theoretic, but I think everybody can get behind setting up a person to get a job.
Yeah.
I think if you think about things like we think about things, there are definite supports. It's more than just, hey, finding the motivation to print out your resume and go get a job. And I think this model, because of setbacks in education, because of setbacks maybe when they've tried to engage previously in employment, maybe setbacks just in life in general and other negative relational experiences, there's so many barriers that I think if you've worked in our field, you've experienced those. It's so much more than just getting a job, yet let's set that as a shorter term goal, which I really appreciated with learning about this in a way, because I know there's some great Saffron Strand. I got some friends out in Richmond, California, doing a lot of, even with homelessness, they say employment first. Now, again, housing is a goal as part of that, but they're giving people volunteer experiences as soon as they enter the program. I know there's some great work being done locally, and my friend Mary does a lot of great work with connecting people to it as well. And I like to think, as we talk so much about trauma, really, in some ways, really devastating our personal narrative or our view of ourselves, what a great self-esteem boost, what a great change to my perception of myself when somebody asks me, what do I do, that I have an answer to that question.
Yep.
And I think that from a psychological perspective is some of the genius behind this, whether it's kind of thought out that way or it's just me overthinking everything in preparation for this, is what a great way to structure your view and help restructure your view of self that trauma can often damage.
Jerry, you talked a lot about the ideas of developmental tasks and relational engagement being some organizing principles that could help IPS and organize all of this. I wonder too what thoughts you had about the idea of safety and how employment can be related to multiple levels of safety. Any thoughts that you had about?
So, that's an interesting question, right? So, safety is both this external experience of I feel safe enough to kind of go and explore and take a risk and kind of do something. But safety is also as I feel competent to manage my internal experiences, right? So you, in order to create safety, you have to kind of both help that individual have the internal resources, but provide the scaffolding around them to be able to both to support and co-regulate, if you want to use that word, what they're feeling, but also encourage the exploration and the taking the risk to kind of do it, to kind of manage that. And I think that in this process of taking a job or doing it, there's both the person taking the opportunity to go out and do it, but is what kind of supports do they need in order to be able to accomplish that? Mm-hmm. So how do I let you swim in a little deeper water, but know that I'm here, that if you start to drown, I'm here to kind of help you to kind of manage that. So I think that balancing out this issue of taking on these risks for a lot of these individuals has to be matched by the appropriate level of support that we're providing them. So that's one of the things I'm thinking about. The other thing I'm thinking about is, after working with youth for a very long time, oftentimes I was able to get the young person in a spot where they've developed the capacity to establish the willingness and the desire to take a risk. And then they enter, say, back into a school situation, and the response from the environment is so rejecting that it reinforces that. And I think that as you're thinking about moving people to employment, you also have to be thinking about how are we educating and informing the people who are employing these individuals to make sure, increase the risk of this being a successful process.
Yeah.
That both things, so that when we're thinking more comprehensively, that this individual is existing in a relational environment, and that you have to create enough of the opportunity both for them to take on this employment experience, but also for the employees and their co-workers to be responsive and sensitive to supporting this effort to make it successful. Because it's great, you can put somebody in a place and the way they act, they elicit negative responses, and now we're back in the same.
Exactly.
So I think safety is both within the person and between people.
Yeah. Well, and I
Does
thought,
that make some sense?
Yeah,
Yes, it does.
and I thought about this for a long time, and have talked to some folks. Again, some I think the innovators that I find here locally and around the country as well with employment. And one of the things that I've been studying the longest around trauma-informed is trauma-informed leadership, and how do we create healthy work environments when there's vicarious trauma, secondary trauma, behavioral outburst. Sometimes our physical safety in our environments might seem or are actually threatened. And so what does it take to maintain a healthy, productive workforce within that environment? And one of the things that I would love to do, and I think people are thinking about this, but it's a little bit, well, like most of the things I think about, it's way out in a different box sometimes, not close to inside anything. But it's like, I really believe too, and I hope this is an opportunity, is that especially in a almost zero unemployment sort of environment that some areas are lucky enough to be in right now, where there's a desperate need, I know here locally in Denver and Colorado, for motivated employees, or just warm bodies in some ways, as I'm talking to folks that are in more of those industries, is that I believe there's such a benefit if we train employers on how to be successful with individuals struggling with maybe mental illness or recovering from substance abuse, setting up a work environment where those folks can thrive, where now you've got a productive, and I've seen some research where if you're able to create a successful work experience, you've got an employee not just for 6 months, a year, that person's going to stick with you because they've built that safety. And I'm fascinated with, could we take our knowledge into a for-profit sort of arena, whether that's a grocery store, whether that's a bakery, whatever that might be, a tech. A lot of my folks went to kind of the vocational tech industries, which most of them ended up making more money than I did, to train employers that I think would not only benefit those folks that we're trying to work with, but also a lot of employers haven't ever been trained in how to create and maintain a healthy work environment anyway. And so I hope this is in some ways a conversation across to the employer. It reminds me a lot of the conversations, again, I have with housing folks, that if you can find a good landlord, it's like gold. Yeah. And you can supply that landlord with consistent support and renters and so on and so forth. And I'm kind of hoping that we see with this movement some ability to spread our message while helping businesses set good environments for everybody. And hopefully, I think that's a stretch from where we were at today, but I think if you go into if you've had negative experiences, struggling with mental health, all these other things, and you go into a negative work environment, that could be a scary experience. Now, it doesn't have to be a damaging long-term experience, but I think it also reinforces that, the importance of a healthy work environment to everybody.
Yeah.
I think the risk, though, is that if I go into an unhealthy work environment, I'm much more likely to attribute that to that environment rather than to myself. When you're dealing with individuals who have this long history, and you put them in the same environment, their attribution is a reinforcement of their negative identity. And so I think the same environment, even though it's negative, has way more risk to
Yeah.
individuals than it
I
would
would
be say,
totally-
to go. So I think that these individuals need to have some preparation of the
Yes.
environment that
Yeah.
they're going to go into.
Yeah.
As opposed to saying, okay, just go in there. If you run into a negative environment, we'll deal
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah.
We're not looking at that piece.
And that's kind of a
So,
hard thing,
It's
is
a very
that,
hard thing. So it's
you know,
it's
yes.
it's just what I'm saying is it's like everything else.
Absolutely.
It's a complex understanding of how do we know employment is part of recovery,
Yeah.
right? We know that it's a developmental task for somebody to get a job and to feel connected. And we also know that in our culture, mental illness, substance abuse, some past, actually physically the way you look
Yeah.
is going to create a stress response in the people that we're putting
Yeah.
them in with.
Yeah.
How do we educate and support these individuals so their response is way more welcome?
Exactly. And what a kind of tough balance, because we don't want them to stigmatize folks walking in. And at the same time, I totally agree, because I've seen, and I think I was fairly healthy when I can say this, but I've walked into an environment pretty healthy and been torn up by it as well. And
Walked out unhealthy.
I consider myself, at least, I'm treating my mental illnesses and addictions and so on and so forth. But it's like, I think there's a power for that. And I think you're right, Jerry, is that, boy, you don't want that to be, somebody's worked up the courage to take this risk and then go into that environment. And yet I think in some ways, I think this motto is, let's get them in the environment of their choice. And how do we, again, nothing
It's just,
simple,
but I'm
but
saying it's not simple. So,
yeah, I think your point is
I
great.
remember I had when I ran a nonprofit for children at the home, I had a board member who wanted to be on the board, but she didn't want to go see the kids and then I actually had the kids come to a board meeting.
Yeah.
And she came up to afterwards to me and she said, I can't believe they're just regular kids. Her
Yes.
internal belief systems
Yeah.
had caused her to avoid interacting
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So in a way, it wasn't just about preparing these kids, it was about managing her.
Right.
So as we try to kind of move people as becoming more integrated back into our community, whether it's in housing situations or whether it's in employment, we really have to educate and engage the community to be open and accepting.
Yes.
And to be able to do both.
Yes. Yeah.
I went to remembering a 2-day training I went to years ago on wraparound services, and it was put on by now I'm blanking on the guy's name. He was one of the developers of wraparound.
John Vanderberg.
Yeah. So John came actually.
I don't know how
you remember this. I'm really impressed.
There's some synapses came together there.
And we asked him one day. This was at the point when wraparound was becoming an evidence-based practice.
Yeah.
So he was like doing a lot of the research, and it was a lot of kind of randomized controlled trials that he was going through. And one of the questions that was asked to him was, if we adopt wraparound as a philosophy, how will we know when we've accomplished it, right? How will we know when we've arrived, essentially? And his answer was really pretty interesting. It wasn't like a data-driven answer at all. He said, when you start to hire people back into your program that you've treated.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that was a pretty interesting answer.
Yeah.
When you start to get family members of kids who've been treated here to be your
So
staff.
we're a good example that wraparound is successful.
Yeah, we are actually.
What an interesting answer, and I've thought about that over
yeah.
the years of, would that be, as you ran a nonprofit, right? You've been involved in one, and I've been a hiring manager for a lot of years, and you always talk about this turnover problem.
Yeah.
Because it's such a difficult field, and people can really only last for so long because of the stress levels, and they kind of have to select out. And I'm like, what if we went a different direction? what if we started doing those kind of
Yeah.
things? Will that change our turnover problem? I don't know the answer to that,
Well,
that question, but it's a really interesting one.
I mean, I had that thought a couple times. I think one of the people that right now are having trouble hiring are some of these residential teachers assistants sort of positions, and in some ways, and I think in other professions, HIV does, I think, a great job of this, of hiring peers, and they're pretty. And I always like to say I love a well-supervised peer program, because I think we're naturally people who have been through some of the trauma that they're going to hear on a daily basis, potentially in the work, are just at a higher rate of vicarious and secondary trauma by nature, though that shouldn't stop us there. And I was thinking of that as well, as like, lived experience, doing okay to a point of starting to look for work. So you're probably not in that hospitalization emergency sort of state. Is could we utilize sort of their lived expertise and create a safe enough environment where they could give back? And maybe that looks more like administrative task at first, that it's not sort of this peer support program, but to have sort of a step and a training program to help. And I think there are the harm reduction world is filled with folks that are maybe even creating programs for other people that are using, and been highly successful with that. So I think, opening our own thinking up around hiring folks and connecting to programs that I know there's some legal issues with, maybe criminal, background sort of things that are legal structures that we can't cross. But I think there's a lot of flexibility that I think your point was one that was sitting in my head too, is are we hiring from this environment, and have we really thought out that in a safe way? And I think some have, and others have room to maybe capitalize.
I have hired.
Mm-hmm.
One is people who have lived experience, as we all have.
Yes.
If you
Yes.
will, right? And I've had both success
Mm-hmm.
and I've had failure.
Yeah.
And where I have had success is where the individual has been successful in creating relational support systems around them, so that when they're dealing with situations that activate them, they have a different narrative to kind of respond to it.
Yeah.
But I've also hired individuals who, especially like dealing with gangs or
Yeah.
other things, where they continue to be exposed to the traumatic experiences they are,
Yeah.
and it wears and tears on them in a different way.
Yeah.
And so what I didn't do is think about, so what do these people need in addition and support that this person,
Right.
so that they would be
Yeah.
successful. I thought, I hired them,
Yeah.
right? But really putting you back into situations, you're going to need a very different level of support system.
Right.
So again, I think it's great for us to have this conversation, but it really is a fairly complex thing.
Yeah.
That what do we need to do to increase the probability of individuals taking these risks are both going to be successful in getting the job,
Yes.
successful sustaining, and that the experiences they have aren't going to become
Right.
re-traumatizing.
Right. Yeah.
That's what, and that's what a trauma-informed lens, right? Is like,
Yes.
I have to work to decrease the likelihood of re-traumatization.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So I think that my experience is I've been successful in sometimes hiring and they do well, but when people run into difficulty
Yeah.
in the system, it really wasn't necessarily the best design model
Yeah.
to help them manage all those things.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it wasn't them, I didn't create the right circumstances for them to be successful.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That would take some serious thought.
Yeah,
to do
so,
that,
but
really
again,
well.
as I felt good about, I gave them an opportunity.
Yes.
I was like,
Right.
no, it takes a little bit more than that.
Yeah.
So, I also know now more than I did back then
Yes.
to kind of do it.
Yeah.
But I think as we're looking at having people reintegrate in our communities, we really do, the same way as when I'm a leader, I have more responsibility to make sure the interaction is a healthy one than the person who's
Yes.
is when we're hiring people into our organization, the organization really has to say, what do we need to do to increase the likelihood of these people being successful?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that level of thinking is, as we come off our last episode of my question around supervision, last couple episodes actually, is so key for that. That's why I say I love well-supervised peer support programs, because we need to realize it. And I think if I'm honest too, sometimes I've hired people their first job out in the world, out of college, and they may be just as vulnerable in some ways, having not experienced any of this, to this as well. But I think, with folks that have been, struggle, in the system, so to speak, in one way, shape, or form or another, whether that's incredibly intense or not as much, it's we know we've got to put those safety pieces to not do harm. And I think we should look at everybody like that. I think all three of us would agree, but especially if you're going to embark on that, I think there's a special opportunity there. And I think that hopefully also in some ways gives us an opportunity to think about an employment situation that, I just watch, and we've got some great grocery stores here locally that hire folks that you can tell probably have struggled with mental illness, developmental issues, all these things. And they, you can kind of watch these folks struggle and thrive at the same time.
And you're exposing people more and more so they get more comfortable.
Exactly. And so it's like, I think for all employers, because, what happens at a checkout line at a grocery store can also trigger a whole lot of stuff as well. And I think that to watch these folks over the years at my neighborhood grocery store kind of thrive and get to know you and smile. They're some of the nicest places. Everybody else is turning over at a rapid rate, but they're kind of the consistency of the checkout experience is pretty cool to see that.
I think it is. It's a great model.
Yeah, and the valuing of the work.
It's not only them, but they're desensitizing all the people coming through the checkout.
Everybody who goes through that line.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. They have to deal with the guy that's not having a good day, or may just be a butthole in general, and then he gets me, depending on the mood I'm in, and if I'm in my best self, I may want to engage in a 20-minute conversation about the Broncos. Maybe I just want to get my freaking hummus, but it's as an overall experience, it's just incredibly positive to watch. And I think the more we can give those opportunities, I always have people think about as well, it is, even if you're not focused on employment, is just a lot of those volunteer sort of tasks. I think one of the things Judith Herman, I think, points this out in her work, is one of the pieces of a lot of folks' recovery is wanting to give back. Is a call, not for everybody, but is a call sort of to give back. Once realizing that they've had the support that they needed to kind of have, like I like to say, their hero's journey, so to speak, is they want to go back and help people that were in their situation. And I think, how we structure, maybe a volunteer activity where they start to show up on time, and the task might not be given back, but is contributing to whether it's our organization or another organization where they can have these positive experiences and building just kind of that momentum over time, has always been really cool when I've been able to offer those to people that have that motivation to start giving back, and getting that feedback from folks, I think, is really cool to watch too.
One thing I thought of, I wonder what you guys think about this, about the need for more and more individuals within any system or within any organization who can help be integrators across people. And I think that's a need here. I was kind of picking up a little bit on that while we were answering questions and hearing a lot of comments, that there was, always when you kind of do these kind of presentations to people, right, especially coming in from the outside a little bit, right, where we're kind of newbies to this whole system. That lack of information about the system helps you to ask different questions. And kind of get people thinking a little bit more about not just the what, but the how we do things, or the why we do things. And I was reflecting on how important that is. And I mean, that's something, Jerry, I've just appreciated about my relationship with you over the years is, I mean, I'm always kind of a detail guy, right? And I want to do the what, and here's how we do it. You always help me with the why. And you always have helped me to start thinking at a different.
And you help me with
At a
the
different
details.
level, right? Right. That's why it works.
He showed up on time. He didn't go over time.
Everything was
good.
He came with slides. They didn't do this morning. You did actually a really good job.
So you know that oftentimes when I'm in a meeting and there's a discussion going on, the discussion quickly moves to, do we pick this idea or this idea? And I will oftentimes say is, why don't we put both of those ideas up and let's talk about how they might be related or how they might lead us to a third idea that integrates that, right? And I think that being integrated means that we keep our individual perspectives and our skills that we bring to the table, but somehow we find a way to connect. Not, I get you to act like me. Right? And I think that's what often happens in these kind of integrated projects.
Yeah.
People are saying, really, what I really want is for you to come in here
It's
and
my
start
way.
be like me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think what you need is a skill set, and this is something that I often ask clinicians, or I often ask, is before we start solving the problem, do we have a shared definition of what the problem
Sure.
is?
Right. How do
And
we
usually
define the
we
problem?
don't.
Right,
We're disagreeing with how to solve it.
Right. Right.
But if we ask that question of, let's take a moment to conceptualize how we're understanding the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when we move to that level and we get agreement, then we could see there's multiple possible solutions.
Right. Yeah. Right.
And that's where it comes in, your thought about teaching people a shared way to think about things.
Yeah. Well, and I think a key part of that, which is why the trauma-informed stuff I think is so powerful. I also, things that go across expertise, I think that's why for some reason we allow everybody to do motivational interviewing, even though it's a cognitive behavioral therapy, where they can't do others. But, you know, with these sort of models that, or philosophies that have a language to them as well, because I think sometimes we sit down with people from, and this is why I love our discussions when I can pick on Curt, which I don't think is picking on, I think I'm learning from, but it's like we come from two different language traditions in some ways. Mm-hmm. You know, and again, I was trained in a little bit of yours, and I know you have a little or a lot of mine as well. So we share that, and I think we're thoughtful enough to come from the common ground and ask questions when I don't maybe understand one of your terms and vice versa. But it's, I think, you know, any model, I think one of the things of its success is, when we talk, do we understand each other? And I think so often, you know, well, I've got to get a person a job. Well, I've got to get a person housing. Well, this person needs inpatient mental health therapy before you do any of this. And sometimes we come with, you know, our own language, our own philosophies, and how do we take some time? I mean, you know, Jerry, a couple times I had this flashback to Denver Children's Home when you get all this group of professionals around a kid, and I've seen these in IEP meetings and wraparound service kind of perspective, which I'm all for, but a lot of times we meet, there's a task, we don't take any time to say, okay, what are the norms for this group? A lot of times they will invite a young child who's dealing with a whole lot of issues to become part of the group, though we haven't normed it or created any psychological safety. And I think part of this experience for me thinking about this kind of new innovative model that builds on a lot of what we've talked about is taking some time to just say, okay, what are our shared values here? How are we going to make decisions? What's our shared language around this? How do we ask questions when we don't understand? And, you know, I think sometimes we're so busy with our to-dos and tasks, which are overwhelming at times in a very real way, is that we we forget that old model of the norming, storming, forming, perform, all those different. I think I said those out of order. My psychology 101 teacher would be appalled. But we sometimes forget what we would expect in a therapeutic group to be the basics of group development. We're just like get together and from all these different perspectives and assume something good's going to come out of it. And
one of the norms, I think it's a great point about norms, and it kind of leads me back to the question about integration, and that oftentimes that should be the job of a leader.
Yeah.
One of the things that I have really remembered over the years of being a new leader to now a little bit more experience as a leader is that your job as a leader is not necessarily to participate in the process.
Yeah.
But it is to monitor the process and be able to help people to understand what's happening within the process. And that's one that my experience has been that a lot of people don't get taught that. So I feel really lucky that I got taught that. And I wonder a lot about how do we teach that to people a little bit better.
Yeah.
And get people to understand that that's a part of the role.
Exactly.
I heard Glenn Sachs talk about this issue about evidence-based treatments, and his point is a lot of the evidence-based treatments are teaching interventions. So people come out of a training or a school and really good at doing the interventions, but not good at problem solving and conceptualizing, right? And so I think that the assumption is that you know how to do that. That's an assumption, right? So there's an assumption that we all get in the room and we know how to solve problems together and know how to do it. And the reality of it is that when we get stressed, we go exactly away from that part of the brain, which is why you need norms to help structure you to stay back. So the very thing we assume is not supported by what we're learning about our neurobiology, right? So I think you make a really good point of saying is, how do we structure this group of people who came together really with the intention of making the best decisions for this child and family and doing it in a way that we can interact and to do it and be sure that we're going to not in a way get stressed and kind of just act. Right? To do it. So I think that, really we're learning as we go along that many things we did were not very therapeutic or very efficient. And some things we did were really, really good.
Right.
And we didn't know it.
We didn't know it.
We didn't know why.
And we're still doing that each and every day.
Right. So the issue is, how do you find time to reflect? When we go in a meeting and it didn't work, what went wrong? Or we did an intervention with a child and family and they did really well. It's like, what did we do?
What did we do?
What
happened?
And taking that time to pause and reflect and celebrate, which I think we do way too little of, and celebrate little steps along the way. And I think, again, looking at some of the outcomes that I've seen of this, there's some things to celebrate that we have. I think a real progressive model for employment. And it takes some resources. You hear, we don't have, the funding doesn't always follow it, and we got to be creative with it, but that's kind of our norm.
The last thing I think in today's I want to say is, when you go and you hear people talking about wanting to integrate and wanting to get people homes or housing and kind of do it, in an environment where much of what we hear doesn't support that. Right?
Yes.
It gives you hope.
Yeah.
And sometimes we get bombarded by one part of what's happening in our culture. And we don't really hear a lot about what's happening in the other parts of our culture. And so being here today instills a sense of hope that there are efforts and people really trying to do the best
Yeah.
for the vulnerable people in our
Absolutely.
society. to kind of do it.
Absolutely.
So I want to take a moment to recognize them
Yes.
and the things that they're doing as
Yeah.
we kind of close today.
And how they helped us integrate.
Exactly.
So I think that's a great place to end, and so it's been fun day of talking with you gentlemen as always. So as every week you can find, we'll put some resources if you're interested in the model up at traumainformedlens.org, as well as some show notes, discussion questions. And if you're listening to this and want to see us sitting in the business, really nice business office of a Sheridan in Lakewood, Colorado, you can check out the video. So we'll see you all next week, and thanks as always for joining us.